Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. The sun was just setting when she tied her shoes. In towns like Brooklyn, Iowa, people don't vanish, not without someone noticing. But that night, no one saw a thing. She went out for a run and never came back. And in the silence that followed, the whole town started to come undone. On July 18, 2018, the summer heat lingered into the early evening. Mollie Cecilia Tibbetts, a 20-year-old University of Iowa student, was staying at her boyfriend's home while he was out of town for work. She had classes, a summer job, a dog to look after, and no known enemies. Mollie wasn't reckless, she was grounded, sharp, and responsible. Every evening she laced up her running shoes and hit the familiar streets of Brooklyn. That Wednesday night was no different, except it was. Dalton Jack, her boyfriend, had been texting her that evening. They were in regular contact. But sometime after 7:30 p.m., her replies stopped. No calls came in. No messages were read. He didn't panic, not at first. Maybe she fell asleep early. Maybe her phone died. But by the next morning, when she didn't show up for her summer job at a local day camp, those assumptions gave way to concern. Calls to her phone went straight to voicemail. Her family hadn't heard from her, and the first 911 call came in before noon. Mollie was officially reported missing. When officers arrived at the house, there were no obvious signs of struggle. Her car was still parked out front. Her wallet and ID were inside. Her red Brooks running shoes were gone, presumably still on her feet. Her Fitbit watch and cell phone, both synced to online accounts, had stopped updating sometime the previous night. By all appearances, Mollie had gone out for a run and never returned. But the data trail suggested something far more troubling. Brooklyn is a small town with a population of just under 1,500. In a place like this, someone's absence doesn't go unnoticed for long. And when the news hit that a young woman had seemingly disappeared without a trace, the entire community mobilized. Local police, the Poweshiek County Sheriff's Office, and volunteers began canvassing the town. Residents opened up their security camera footage. Volunteers mapped cornfields and tree lines. Drones were deployed. People searched on foot, on bikes, on horseback. And as pressure grew, so did the involvement of outside agencies, including the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and the FBI. The first week brought no answers. Not one credible sighting, no ransom calls, no signs of foul play, no abandoned shoes, clothing, or signs of a struggle. To many watching from the outside, it seemed as though Mollie had simply evaporated into the hot Iowa air. But investigators knew better. Disappearances don't just happen, not without leaving a digital trace. And in the absence of a crime scene, they turned to data, a strategy that would soon unravel one of the most haunting cases Iowa had ever seen. Her Fitbit watch showed her last heartbeat at approximately 8:16 p.m. The GPS signal had gone silent just south of Brooklyn. It wasn't conclusive, but it was the first concrete timestamp that investigators had. A slice of time where something clearly changed. So where was she? The investigation zeroed in on a 1-mile stretch of gravel road, a route she commonly ran. Authorities requested footage from any resident along that stretch. Some didn't even know they had usable security footage. Many systems had default settings that only saved a day or two's worth of data. Still, some were intact. And from one such home came a blurry but important breakthrough. A vehicle matching the description of a dark-colored Chevrolet Malibu appeared multiple times on the camera. Once at 7:45 p.m. again minutes later, circling back. The vehicle's motion stood out. It wasn't just passing through, it was slowing down, tracking. The footage wasn't sharp enough to make out the plates, but investigators were confident this wasn't a local making an ordinary commute. It was a clue, not a smoking gun, but a direction. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued combing through digital records, cell tower pings, banking data, social media activity. Nothing in Mollie's recent life suggested she was planning to leave town, meet someone in secret, or run away. She just started a new semester. She was working. She had plans for the weekend. There were no signs of distress or conflict in her texts, no unusual purchases, no fights with friends or family. Everything stopped at that one moment on July 18th. This presented a challenge. No witnesses, no cries for help, no camera footage of an abduction, only a girl who vanished mid-run. But this wasn't the first time the FBI had built a case from absence. With no obvious crime scene, they leaned into digital forensics. And soon, the Chevrolet Malibu would lead them somewhere very real. Before that could happen, however, the community began to fracture under the weight of the unknown. Rumors began circulating. Was it someone she knew? Was it random? Could it be someone from outside the town? Could it be someone local? Theories multiplied, but facts remained scarce. Some viewers might be wondering, how does someone vanish on a regular evening run in a place where everyone knows everyone? That's the question investigators were asking too, and the first real answer was coming, caught frame by frame on a camera that almost got erased. But before we go there, ask yourself, if someone had been watching her route for days, how long would it take to find the perfect time to strike? When a disappearance occurs in a small community, the first 48 hours can mean the difference between resolution and a cold case. In Brooklyn, Iowa, law enforcement knew from the outset that their best chance to find Mollie Tibbetts alive depended on securing every possible lead before it vanished. By the morning of July 19th, search operations were already underway. The Poweshiek County Sheriff's Office coordinated with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation to set up a command post. The scope expanded quickly. Cornfields, gravel roads, wooded areas, and drainage ditches were mapped into grid sections. Volunteers were assigned specific areas, each required to check in and out so that no location was missed or duplicated. The house where Mollie had been staying was processed first. There was no sign of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no visible blood or signs of a struggle. Her phone charger was still plugged in next to the bed. Investigators collected her running gear inventory, confirming that only her red Brooks running shoes and Fitbit watch were unaccounted for. Those two missing items aligned with the working theory. She disappeared mid-run. To supplement physical searches, digital forensics teams requested Mollie's Fitbit data from the company. The results were time-stamped. Her last recorded activity, a run, ended abruptly just after 8:15 p.m., the night before. The signal loss corresponded with a location south of town, near a sparsely populated rural stretch. This was not yet proof of a crime, but it provided the first defined search perimeter. Next came cell phone records. Investigators subpoenaed tower ping data from Mollie's carrier, covering the evening of July 18th. Her phone connected to a local tower until just after her last Fitbit reading, then went offline. The sudden absence of both GPS and cell signals indicated either a powered-down device, a destroyed device, or one moved to an area without coverage. In Iowa's flat farmland, total dead zones were rare. That fact raised concern inside the command post. Community involvement was immediate and intense. Residents reviewed their own home surveillance systems for any sign of Mollie or suspicious activity. Some handed over hours of footage. Others allowed officers to review their cameras on site. The most relevant discovery came from a home along one of Mollie's regular running routes. A vehicle, a dark-colored Chevrolet Malibu, was captured passing the camera multiple times between 7:45 and 8:15 p.m. Its speed was inconsistent, slowing significantly when passing through the frame. The resolution was insufficient to read a license plate, but it was clear that this was not random traffic. From an investigative standpoint, this was now the most important lead. Detectives cross-referenced known vehicles in the area, eliminating local commuters and delivery routes. The Malibu didn't match any registered to residents along that corridor. In towns like Brooklyn, unusual traffic patterns don't go unnoticed, especially when caught on camera. Alongside the vehicle lead, officers interviewed dozens of potential witnesses. Runners, cyclists, and motorists who'd been in the area that night were asked for dashcam footage, or if they had seen Mollie. While several people confirmed seeing her jogging that evening, no one reported witnessing an interaction, an altercation, or anything they perceived as threatening at the time. The absence of an eyewitness account put more weight on the digital trail. Investigators began working to enhance the surveillance footage for potential plate recognition. At the same time, they obtained data from traffic and security cameras in neighboring towns to determine if the Malibu had been captured again before or after the window of interest. The goal was to map its movement before and after Mollie's route. Publicly, officials kept their statements measured. They confirmed ongoing searches and encouraged community assistance, but withheld details about the vehicle to protect the integrity of the lead. In a case where there was no confirmed crime scene, the strategy was to quietly close in on any potential suspect without alerting them. The broader reality for residents was unsettling. Doors that had never been locked at night were now secured. Joggers altered their routines or stopped running altogether. Parents drove their children to school instead of letting them walk. The ripple effect of a single disappearance had shifted the town's sense of safety overnight. For investigators, the operating theory was simple. Mollie encountered someone during her run, voluntarily or not, and the encounter led to her disappearance. The vehicle was likely connected to that encounter. What remained unknown was whether it belonged to someone from inside the community or an outsider who knew the area well enough to avoid detection. It's a question worth asking yourself. In a town where everyone knows everyone else's business, which would be more dangerous, someone new or someone familiar? In any missing person investigation, one of the most critical phases is narrowing the pool of potential suspects. By late July 2018, 2 weeks after Mollie Tibbetts vanished in Brooklyn, Iowa, the strongest lead investigators had was the dark Chevrolet Malibu caught on residential surveillance. That single detail, its make, model, and movement pattern, became the centerpiece of the case file. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation partnered with the FBI's technical unit to run the footage through enhancement software. While the image quality was too poor for an immediate license plate read, analysts were able to isolate unique characteristics: an aftermarket chrome strip along the trunk, a dent on the passenger side rear door, and a temporary tag placement inconsistent with Iowa registration norms. Those specifics made the search more efficient. This wasn't just any Malibu, it was one with identifiable quirks. Investigators began cross-referencing state DMV records for matching vehicles, starting with registered owners within a 50-mile radius of Brooklyn. At the same time, they pulled traffic camera logs from surrounding counties. On July 18th, between 6:30 p.m. and 9 o'clock p.m., the same Malibu was recorded entering Brooklyn from the west, lingering within the town limits, and exiting again toward rural county roads. This pattern aligned with the time frame from Mollie's Fitbit and cell phone data. Detectives approached the search cautiously. They couldn't afford to alert the driver before gathering enough corroborating evidence. Door-to-door interviews continued along Mollie's running route. Residents were shown still frames of the Malibu in hopes of recognition. One farm worker mentioned seeing a similar vehicle parked on a rural road more than once in the weeks before Mollie disappeared. That statement, though not definitive, suggested the possibility of premeditation, someone watching her route over time. Digital forensics expanded beyond Mollie's devices. Investigators obtained tower dump data for cell phones active along her route during the critical time window. Each device ID was compared to subscriber information, then cross-checked with vehicle registrations. The process was tedious but necessary. The goal was to match a phone's movement with the Malibu's path. One handset ID did stand out. Its activity placed it within 100 yards of Mollie's last known Fitbit location at precisely 8:15 p.m. The same ID pinged a tower farther east about 20 minutes later, along the same rural road where the Malibu was last captured on camera. This correlation between the vehicle sighting and the phone's movement was a turning point. Surveillance reviews extended to nearby businesses. A gas station clerk in a neighboring town recalled a dark sedan stopping for fuel on the night in question. The timestamp was only 40 minutes after Mollie's signals went dark. Footage from that station was requested and preserved. While the angle did not capture the driver's face, it clearly showed the Malibu's distinctive dent. By the first week of August, the investigative team had compiled a dossier: the vehicle's route, the probable phone ID linked to it, and multiple camera captures from different locations. The pieces were forming a trackable trail. What they didn't yet have was a confirmed identity of the driver, or definitive proof tying the vehicle's occupant to Mollie's disappearance. The community remained restless. Volunteers still searched, but optimism was waning. Law enforcement held back public release of the vehicle's image, fearing it might prompt the driver to destroy evidence or flee. Internally, however, the urgency increased. For seasoned investigators, one question lingered. If this driver had nothing to hide, why had they passed the same stretch of road multiple times that evening? And why did their cell phone data intersect perfectly with the timeline of Mollie's disappearance? This was no longer a random lead. It was the most direct path to the truth. The next step would be to locate that vehicle, identify the driver, and determine what, if anything, connected them to the missing college student. By early August 2018, the investigation into Mollie Tibbetts' disappearance had shifted from broad area searching to targeted suspect work. The dark Chevrolet Malibu was no longer just a piece of circumstantial evidence. It was the most actionable lead in the case file. The break came when investigators matched the Malibu's distinctive damage and aftermarket chrome trim to a specific registration. The vehicle was tied to a rural residence in Poweshiek County, not far from Mollie's running route. Surveillance from multiple locations, along with cell tower data, placed this car in the immediate vicinity of her last recorded Fitbit activity on the night she vanished. Detectives coordinated with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation to set up an approach. This was not a no-knock warrant situation. At this stage, they needed cooperation, not flight. Two plainclothes agents drove to the property under the pretext of a neighborhood canvass. The driver of the Malibu agreed to speak with them. The conversation was recorded in full. Investigators started with neutral questions: how long he'd lived in the area, whether he was familiar with Brooklyn, and if he'd seen anyone matching Mollie's description. Initially, the driver denied any knowledge of her. He claimed to have been working and running errands on July 18th. The strategy in interviews like this is to allow the subject to commit to a version of events before introducing evidence. Once the baseline story was established, detectives showed him still images from the surveillance footage, the Malibu, passing through town multiple times that evening. The driver acknowledged the car was his, but insisted he didn't recall driving near the area where Mollie was last seen. At this point, investigators shifted focus to physical evidence. They requested consent to search the vehicle. The driver agreed. The Malibu was impounded and processed in a controlled forensic environment. Technicians followed a structured evidence collection protocol, photographing the exterior, swabbing door handles, collecting fiber samples from the seats, and vacuuming floor mats. The most significant finding came from the trunk area. Under ultraviolet light, faint stains were detected on the trunk liner. These were swabbed and packaged for DNA testing. While the results would take days to confirm, the discovery immediately elevated the status of the driver from a person of interest to a prime suspect. Inside the cabin, investigators recovered a partial hair strand wedged between the rear seat and trunk pass-through. It was also sent for DNA analysis. These were not yet definitive links, but the combination of digital data, vehicle location history, and potential biological evidence created a chain that would be difficult to dismiss. Parallel to the forensic work, agents began examining the suspect's phone records. GPS history, recovered from a Google account sync, showed movements consistent with the Malibu's known route on July 18th. Significantly, there was a gap in data during the exact time frame Mollie's devices went dark, followed by a reappearance of the phone's signal east of Brooklyn. That gap mirrored the vehicle's movement between camera captures. The suspect was interviewed a second time after these findings were logged. While maintaining he had no role in Mollie's disappearance, his account of July 18th began to shift. The discrepancies between his first and second statements were noted for later use in court. By now, the case had transitioned in tone. It was no longer a search for a missing person. It was the assembly of a homicide investigation. The focus was on building an evidence package that could withstand cross-examination, ensuring that when the arrest came, there would be no procedural weakness to exploit. The community was not informed of these developments. Public statements remained vague, emphasizing ongoing investigative efforts and the continued need for information. Behind the scenes, however, the investigative team knew they were moving toward a critical point, confronting the suspect with the full weight of the evidence. For those following the case closely, the unanswered question was no longer whether the Malibu's driver knew something. It was how much he was willing to admit before the forensic results came back. Within days of seizing the Chevrolet Malibu, the evidence swabs from its trunk liner and the hair strand from the rear seat had been logged into the Iowa State Crime Lab's high-priority queue. Missing person cases with viable biological samples receive expedited processing, and by mid-August 2018, the results were in. The trunk liner swabs returned a full DNA profile. When cross-checked against Mollie Tibbetts' known genetic profile from a prior medical sample provided by her family, the match was absolute. The probability of that DNA belonging to anyone else was statistically near zero. This was not a trace contaminant, The concentration indicated the biological material came from direct transfer, consistent with blood or tissue contact. The hair strand was equally damning. Mitochondrial DNA testing confirmed it originated from Mollie's maternal line, and given that no close female relatives had ever been in contact with the suspect or his vehicle, the chain of logic was straightforward. Two separate biological sources inside the same car tied directly to the missing woman. For investigators, the nature of these findings shifted the operational objective. Up until now, there had been a slim chance Mollie might still be alive, held somewhere, possibly against her will. The DNA in the trunk significantly reduced that probability. It pointed toward a fatal encounter. The investigative team met in closed session to review their options. The digital timeline was already strong. Vehicle location records, cell tower pings, and surveillance footage had all placed the suspect in proximity to Mollie during the disappearance window. Now, with forensic evidence directly connecting her to the inside of his vehicle, probable cause for arrest was solid. What remained was the choice between bringing him in immediately or conducting one more round of interviews to capture any incriminating statements before charges were filed. Detectives opted for a controlled re-interview. The suspect was contacted under the pretense of clarifying earlier statements. The meeting took place in a neutral location, with audio and video recording in place. Early in the conversation, he was confronted with the DNA results. His initial response was to deny any explanation for how Mollie's biological material ended up in his car. When pressed, he suggested she might have been in the area where the vehicle had been parked and possibly brushed against it, an assertion inconsistent with the location of the DNA inside the trunk. The inconsistencies in his statements were documented in detail. Investigators didn't need a confession to proceed. The physical evidence was enough to secure a conviction in court. However, they remained attentive to any partial admissions, as even minor acknowledgments could further corroborate the forensic record. While the suspect's narrative shifted under pressure, he did not admit to harming Mollie. Instead, he repeated variations of "I don't remember" and "I might have seen her, but I didn't do anything." The interview ended without a full confession, but it provided prosecutors with more examples of inconsistent testimony, valuable for trial. At the same time, search teams were redeployed. The forensic evidence confirmed Mollie had been in the Malibu. Now, investigators needed to locate her body. A review of the suspect's GPS history highlighted rural locations where his phone had stopped for significant intervals on the night of July 18th and the morning of July 19th. These sites were prioritized for ground searches, with cadaver dogs and specialized equipment brought in. Behind the operational precision was an unspoken truth. The DNA evidence had closed the chapter on Mollie's disappearance as a missing person case. It was now officially a homicide investigation. The public still did not know these details. Outwardly, law enforcement continued to encourage community tips, careful to protect the integrity of the evidence chain. But inside the investigation, the direction was clear. The focus had moved from searching for a living victim to building an unassailable case that would withstand trial and deliver a conviction. When you look at the case from this point forward, it's worth asking, if DNA evidence places a victim inside a suspect's vehicle, how likely is it that any alternate explanation could hold up under the scrutiny of a jury? The trial of Cristhian Bahena Rivera began in a crowded Iowa courtroom nearly 3 years after the disappearance of Mollie Tibbetts. From the first day, prosecutors focused on building a case anchored in hard evidence, DNA results, GPS data, and Rivera's own recorded statements. The defense worked to challenge the reliability of that evidence, raising questions about investigative methods and the absence of the murder weapon. The jury, selected after an extensive screening process to minimize outside bias, listened as investigators reconstructed Mollie's final moments with precision. Surveillance footage placed her jogging along Middle Street in Brooklyn, Iowa on the evening of July 18, 2018. Not long after, her phone activity stopped. GPS records from Rivera's black Chevy Malibu showed the car repeatedly circling the area where witnesses recalled seeing a dark sedan trailing a young woman. By 10:15 p.m., the vehicle was parked for roughly 40 minutes in a remote cornfield, the same field where Mollie's remains would later be found. When crime scene technicians processed Rivera's vehicle, they documented Mollie's running shoes and a black athletic top in the trunk. Traces of blood on the trunk liner were sent to the state crime lab, and the results were conclusive. The DNA belonged to Mollie. The chain of custody for each item was established in court, eliminating any suggestion of contamination. The state medical examiner testified that Mollie had sustained multiple sharp force injuries consistent with stabbing. The wounds were located in areas indicating intentional targeting rather than defensive contact alone. No drugs or alcohol were found in her system. The murder weapon was never recovered, but the injury pattern left little doubt about the cause and manner of death. Jurors were shown segments of Rivera's August 2018 interview with investigators. At first, he denied knowing anything about Mollie's disappearance. Later, he admitted approaching her during her jog, claimed she threatened to call police, and stated that he blacked out before realizing she was in his trunk. The defense described the confession as the product of coercion, but the footage showed Rivera calm and willing throughout the interview. The defense pressed on the fact that no murder weapon had been recovered and that the DNA evidence proved Mollie was in the vehicle, not necessarily that Rivera killed her. The prosecution countered by stressing the weight of the combined evidence: the GPS trail, the surveillance images, the forensic results, and Rivera's own words, all aligning to form a single, coherent sequence of events. As the trial progressed, it became clear that this case was more than a legal battle. It was a methodical assembly of facts meant to close every gap in the timeline. For the community, the proceedings were also a reminder of how quickly an ordinary routine could be disrupted by violence. The courtroom heard not only the scientific breakdown of the case, but also the silent impact it left on an entire town. By the time closing arguments began, the trial had distilled itself into two sharply defined narratives. On one side, the prosecution maintained that the case against Cristhian Bahena Rivera was built on an unbroken chain of evidence: the GPS path of his vehicle, the surveillance images, Mollie Tibbetts' DNA in his trunk, and his own recorded admissions. On the other side, the defense argued that these elements, while suspicious, were circumstantial when viewed without the missing murder weapon or a clear motive. The courtroom was silent as the lead prosecutor walked the jury through the timeline one final time. He highlighted the consistency between Rivera's statements and the physical evidence recovered. He reminded them of the 40-minute window when Rivera's car was stationary in the cornfield, the same field where Mollie's body was found weeks later. The blood evidence in the trunk had been matched to Mollie with a statistical probability so high that the state crime lab expert called it indistinguishable from a full match. The defense countered by focusing on what was absent. No knife was ever found. There were no fingerprints or eyewitnesses placing Rivera at the exact moment of the killing. They questioned the interview process, suggesting that fatigue and language barriers may have influenced Rivera's statements, yet the prosecution anticipated these points. They called back the lead investigator, who testified that Rivera spoke and understood English sufficiently to follow the questions, and that he never asked for an interpreter during the recorded interview. Furthermore, the GPS data and physical evidence were collected independently of his statements, and each pointed toward the same conclusion. The jurors were reminded of the autopsy results: multiple sharp force injuries consistent with a stabbing, the pattern indicating deliberate targeting rather than a struggle gone wrong. The examiner's testimony had been clear: these were not accidental wounds. After final instructions from the judge, the jury retired to deliberate. Hours passed. In the gallery, Mollie's family sat together, eyes fixed on the closed doors. On the other side, Rivera's relatives waited in equally tense silence. When the jury returned, the clerk read the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Rivera showed little visible reaction. The sentence, mandated by Iowa law, was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The case that had gripped a small town and later the nation closed in that moment, but the impact remained. For law enforcement, it was an example of how digital traces, forensic science, and methodical investigation can converge to reveal the truth, even in the absence of a weapon. For the community, it was a reminder of how vigilance and cooperation between neighbors can help bring resolution to a family's worst nightmare. On August 30th, 2021, the courtroom in Davenport, Iowa, was silent as the judge read the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole for Cristhian Bahena Rivera. The decision came after the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder in the death of 20-year-old Mollie Tibbetts. There was no opportunity for leniency. The statute in Iowa is clear. Such a conviction carries only one outcome. Mollie's family stood together in the front row. Their statements were direct and unembellished. They spoke of a daughter, sister, and friend whose life ended abruptly on a summer evening run, and of the void left behind. Rivera, wearing a prison-issued suit, offered no apology, maintaining his claim that others were responsible, a claim the evidence in court had dismantled. Defense attorneys filed appeals, citing procedural concerns and the emergence of alternative suspects. These motions were heard and reviewed, but appellate courts upheld the original verdict. The physical evidence, traces of Mollie's blood found in Rivera's trunk, cell phone data showing his vehicle following her jogging route, and his own statements to investigators, remained decisive. In Brooklyn, Iowa, the case left lasting marks. Residents who once left doors unlocked began checking locks twice. The University of Iowa's student community initiated safety programs, encouraging tracking apps for runners and stronger neighborhood watch coordination. Mollie's name became part of outreach campaigns across the state, a reminder that safety in small towns cannot be assumed. For law enforcement, the investigation reinforced the value of integrating digital forensics, cell tower pings, surveillance footage, and vehicle tracking into rural policing. It also highlighted the strain such cases place on small departments and the need for interagency cooperation. Mollie Tibbetts' story remains a cautionary record in Iowa's criminal history, a reminder of how quickly ordinary days can turn and how the methodical pursuit of facts, without embellishment, can secure justice. Her family has since chosen to focus on community programs that reflect her values rather than her final moments. Looking back on this case, I'm reminded how quickly life can change and how justice depends on the facts we choose to protect. We can't control every danger, but we can stay alert, support one another, and demand accountability. What does safety mean in your own community, and how do you protect it? If this story moved you, or even challenged your view, share your thoughts below and tell me where you're watching from. And if you want to hear more true stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.